Hi, everyone. As a co-chair of the Video Games Working Group, I'm honored to moderate this discussion. It will be a vital exploration into an increasingly relevant, yet still underexplored intersection, the hate of nexus, extremism, and gaming. I'm Davey Gartenstein-Ross. I'm the founder and CEO of Valens Global, and I'll introduce our excellent panelists as we go to them in this conversation. In a world where technology and virtual communities have become integral parts of our daily lives, understanding these dynamics within the gaming sphere and how gaming can be used as a source for ill as well as a source for good has never been more crucial. The landscape of our discussion today is one that has evolved significantly in recent years. Once considered a relatively uncharted territory, there's now a growing corpus of literature dedicated to uncovering the nexus between hate, extremism, and gaming. The Video Games Working Group is going to explore the presence of gamers and gaming culture within extremist communities, the unsettling gamification of extremism itself, the co-optation of gaming aesthetics and culture by extremist actors, the development of games by extremist actors, and vulnerabilities that may be present in relevant communities. We will not only explore the problem, but also discuss how gaming can be used as a force for good, something you'll get a wonderful window into in this discussion. The discussion that we're going to have in this plenary seeks to shed light on the topic in a manner that's relevant to scholars, practitioners, and members of the community. Despite the progress made in understanding the problem, there's one glaring gap: the lack of robust solutions, something that we hope to dig into in today's panel. I'd like to begin with Jacob Davey, who is the head of research and policy at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue. He leads initiatives on hate speech, international far-right political violence, and tracking US, UK, Canadian, and Australian hate groups. Jacob, what do we mean when we talk about hate and extremism in gaming? What's the nature of the phenomenon?
So, as we've heard over the past few days, there is this continuum, right, whereby hate creates permissive environments which allow extremism to grow and can prompt violence. And so if you think about that continuum, the intersection between gaming and extremism kind of plots along that. So at one end, you've got concerns about radicalization in gaming space. You've got extremists creating games. As you move up, you've got extremists operating on platforms built to support gamers, platforms like Discord. And then going up to the further end, you've got a broader culture of toxicity and hate. And this all overlaps with a broader culture, right? So gamers are often very online people. As we all know, so are contemporary extremists. And so that creates a potential nexus for flow of information and radicalization. If I were to prioritize that spectrum, though, I think the ones further down the end, extremist-made games, grooming in gaming, is something which has had a lot of attention in the press because it's snappy, it grabs headlines, but it's really poorly evidenced. What I think we should be focusing about is that broader culture. So stats from the ADL and others have pointed to around a third of gamers personally experiencing hate speech. And then if you look at broader abuse, that goes up to 90%. The final other thing I would just use to frame this is when we're talking about gaming, we're not talking about a monolith, right? We're talking about different ecosystems, different platforms. So we've got the games themselves, we've got the marketplaces which sell games and have communities on them. And then you've got that set of platforms like live streaming platforms, chat channels, where gamers can gather. And each of those have their own issues, but I think we can probably get into that further down the conversation.
Definitely. And I'd like to integrate in next Dr. Rachel Kowert, who's a renowned scholar and researcher on the uses and effects of digital games on physical, social, and psychological well-being. She's the research director at Take This and also addresses these topics and more on her YouTube channel, Zeitgeist, which serves to bridge the gap between moral panic and game-related topics. So Rachel, could you give your perspective about whether games offer a particularly fertile ground for either extremist exploitation or the other problem set that Jacob introduces as a separate one, which is just the general normalization of hate, bias, prejudice?
Yes, first of all, thank you for the YouTube plug. I didn't know that was part of my bio. Yes, games are particularly vulnerable, which is something I talk a lot about in my work. I come from game studies and have moved into looking at extremism and counterterrorism versus coming from a counterterrorism background. So I feel like I have a different lens and a different cultural perspective to bring when it comes to talking about how digital games are unique in the landscape of digital threats. So there are a lot of different vulnerabilities we could talk about, but I'm going in the rule of threes. There are the fact that relationships form faster and quicker in games because you're engaged in a shared activity, and research finds that that leads to friendships essentially being emotionally jump-started, and they form backwards. So you have a foundational level of trust that's built at the beginning, and then slowly over time you get to know someone, and that can be leveraged nefariously. The other aspect is content, which Jacob talked about. These experiences are housed within content, which could be off-the-shelf content that is leveraged to further narratives like ethnocentric views of the world, or it could also be bespoke games that are created specifically to send a message. And then the third thing we need to talk about is gamer cultures. So all of this is housed within a wider cultural ecosystem. I think if I said the word gamer, you've got an image in your mind, right? And it is a set of attributes and a set of ideas and cultures that bring everyone together regardless of their background or what kind of games they play. Now, gamer cultures are great and inclusive and wonderful. I would definitely call myself a gamer, but they're also characterized by hate and harassment. And one thing that I would like to mention from my recent work that I'm doing, funded by the Department of Homeland Security, thank you for funding this project, we asked gamers, do you find toxicity to be a normal aspect of culture? Is it normalized? Is it culturally accepted? 80% said yes. We asked, is hate normalized and accepted? 75% said yes. We asked about specific extremist ideologies, misogyny, racism, white nationalism, anti-LGBTQIA hate, and the lowest on that was 65% who said yes, these are normalized. So we're working in a culture in which these are just normal sentiments that people are exposed to every day.
So you bring in statistics and metrics there, and in that vein, I want to turn back to Jacob, and I want to focus in on your project, Gamers Who Hate, and the methodology that you found useful for similarly tracking the threat, tracking these attitudes.
So I think that's an interesting one. So this was some work we conducted a couple of years ago. And what we were doing was looking at those gaming adjacent platforms I laid out at the top to try and understand the dynamics of extremist activity and mobilization on them, and to test the hypothesis that there might be concerted radicalization efforts playing out in these spaces. So we looked at 4 platforms. We looked at the live streaming platforms, Twitch and DLive. Both of those, well, Twitch, hugely more popular than DLive, but both used by people to stream their gaming activity. Both also platforms which have had issues with extremism. DLive was used to live stream the January 6th insurrection. Twitch has been used to live stream 2 tragedies, mass casualty attacks at a synagogue in Halle in Germany, yep, and in Buffalo, New York. We also then looked at the marketplace, Steam, and then Discord, which is the chat app which was originally set up to facilitate gaming community build-out, and which has also had a track record with extremism. It was used by the Buffalo attacker. It was also used to plan the Charlottesville rallies. The challenge with the methodology and the research here is, unlike traditional social media research, where you have data access afforded through APIs, and whereby you can sort of gather large sets of data, you can't really do that on these platforms. You have to use an ethnographic approach. So analysts have to embed, they either have to watch large quantities of live content, or dig into a community to really understand what's happening. And I think that is one of the big barriers to our work here, is the fact that it's quite difficult to build up evidence bases which go beyond the anecdotal. Now, in these cases, we selected quite large sets, we monitored for some time, and we got some interesting findings. But to your point on methodology, that was one of the barriers. If I could quickly go into findings on that as well.
Yeah, please.
And I'll just zoom in on Discord and Steam, because they're both quite interesting. So on Discord, we embedded in 30 white supremacist channels. One of the things which really jumped out to us there was how young the users were. A number of them had polls, so of course there's the caveat there that people might be spoofing them, but the average age was 15. So if we're talking about extremist use of gaming adjacent platforms, I think there really is a concern for youth radicalization there. But when we drilled into what these communities were talking about when it came to games, it was the use of memes, the use of the discussion of culture, the discussion of their favorite games. But it was evidence, really, that they were people who had this sort of extremist mindset, and games were just being used to reinforce the community. Same on Steam. We looked at a network of 300 interconnected white nationalist channels there. The interesting thing about Steam is it has quite lax content moderation. So some of these communities were up to a decade old, right? There were some interesting dynamics there. There were people who were role-playing in history games, win the war as the Nazis, or fight the Crusades. There was some evidence there that people were off-ramping users to their websites. But again, when you really drilled into the games, the games they were playing were popular titles, Counter-Strike, games which I play, right? And that's where we landed on the Gamers Who Hate title, because actually what we were finding is these were gamers, these were people who hated, but there wasn't that through line. And I think that's a really important notion to push back on, is that gaming itself is in some way an inherent engine room for radicalization. Yeah. And I have heard, as this topic has become more pronounced in policy circles, people trying to lean into that. And I want to step away from sort of a revisit of the 90s moral panics around gaming.
100%.
Let's not do that. Yeah.
And I think that's an important point. And it's a good transition to Luke, but I'll say that nobody on this panel is anti-games. Instead, when we look at the range of tools that we have, that technology brings to us, obviously for each one that's amazing and makes our lives better, there are going to be bad people out there who think about how to use them to do bad things. Games are no different in that regard. So to pivot from using this tool to do bad things, I want to turn to Luke, Luke Bernard, who's a game designer. He's the founder of Voices of the Forgotten, and also the director of The Light in the Darkness, which is the first video game specifically about the Holocaust, as opposed to the very well-known World War II games that don't really broach that underlying issue. In using video games as an educational tool to help reduce hate, one of his latest endeavors was releasing the first Holocaust museum within Fortnite. So Luke, I want to begin with Light in the Darkness and what prompted you to create it and what impact you were hoping to have.
So I think why I created it is because video games were bigger than movies and music combined. We're the shapers of culture. We really are. And the fact that, so many World War II games, but game developers were too scared to ever address the Holocaust. And that's because a lot of organizations, anti-hate organizations, did not understand video games. So they assumed anything which was done in a video game is bad. So that's why no one kind of had tackled it before. So I self-financed it, released it for free, because so it's interesting. At first, it was meant to kind of just be something, you know, to memorize the 6 billion who died. But then, as anti-Semitism kept on going up in this country, I realized that it actually became kind of very super relevant to today. And so when I launched it in February, and we continued to port it to more platforms, we've had over 350,000 people who have finished it. Keyword finished, not just downloaded. It's done well throughout the world, like it's been a hit in Saudi Arabia, so that's why I translated it to Arabic. And so what I noticed with the people playing the game is that by the end of the game, I felt like they had maybe changed a bit, kind of as people, because they were actually crying, talking about racism in the world, just talking about all kind of injustices that still happen today. So I think it really, you know, I'll probably know more years from now if it has really worked or not, but my gut feeling it has kind of worked, because stories are the most powerful things in the world, pretty much, you know, like film, books, all those things. And that's why I think video games can be used for good. They can actually make society more empathetic. Because that's one thing, I think we focus so much on, like, there's a lot of Nazis who use video games. And we just kind of stop the Nazis from using video games, but we're not thinking about using video games to be able to make the world more empathetic. And so that's kind of what I focus on.
Great. And I'll dive into some design principles with you momentarily, but first I want to shift back to Rachel. So Rachel, following Gamergate, harassment has been associated with hateful mobilization in the gaming space. Could you tell us about misogynistic rhetoric or abuse, as well as experiences of other vulnerable communities in this space based on your research?
Certainly. So while there's a saturation of hate, harassment, toxicity from one spectrum to another, non-white heterosexual men are certainly far more vulnerable to be a victim and a witness of all of these kinds of behaviors. And I think that's a really important point to keep in mind when we're talking about intervention strategies and how they need to be tailored to different communities. Because again, when I say the word gamer, I'm sure you pictured a white male heterosexual teenager maybe living in his parents' basement, but that's not, you know, the reality of what we're talking about. Half of all game players are women. Half of the world's population plays games. The largest market isn't even North America, even though we do make a lot of games here. So I think it's important not to think of players as monoliths or games as monoliths. And just to touch on Luke's point about games creating culture, I've long said that games reflect culture. So we've seen, you know, higher rates of misogynistic rhetoric and this in kind of just general culture, but they can also create it. So it's a bilateral relationship.
Right, so turning back to you, Luke, as I said, I wanted to dig into design philosophy a little bit and ask about what your philosophy is behind designing a good game that can challenge discriminatory or antisocial attitudes and behaviors.
Well, so I can say how Design the Light in the Darkness is, so what I noticed was Holocaust education, not all Holocaust education, of course. In general, it focused so much on people's deaths and how the Nazis did it. So nearly in a way, it was kind of like providing a blueprint towards young teenagers how to be a Nazi or how to commit a genocide. So with the game, I decided to place the story first and the Jewish characters first, because to me, there's 6 million stories to be told, and we need to humanize the victims. There's also another interesting design thing which I had too for the game. So originally I had thought of including Holocaust survivor testimony, but then I decided against it because most people died. They did in the Holocaust. You know, in Europe, we feel it still, we do. I think in America, people don't understand that very much. And so that's why I had to also kind of have, because if it would have been Holocaust survivor testimony, they would have thought, the audience would have thought most people survived. So that's also why the characters kind of at the end, they do die, pretty much, but at the end, I'm spoiling a bit at the end, but basically at the end when the last character gets deported to Auschwitz, After I showed the lives they would have lived, and then after that, I showed the photos of real people. And that's when people really start to break down and actually start to understand, how huge that genocide was, and kind of puts. So that's why I have this kind of different design philosophy where, when it comes to Holocaust stuff, because in terms of the Fortnite Holocaust Museum, which I know sounds a bit weird, I decided again not to focus on the Nazis, just tell the stories of people who died, or people that, brave people who helped fight the Nazis, all those things. So I just have a different philosophy, because I do really feel like America has made Nazis cool. I mean, if you look at just entertainment, film, I mean, so that's why I think a lot of young people are actually, even in video games, right? Because you can play as Nazis, you can.
Yeah.
And in some video games, like all hell let loose, it's just the German army. It is. So, yeah, even I'd say video games are part of the problem, because we've actually made Nazis cool. And then we're complaining that all these young people, these teenagers, are becoming Nazis, and that Nazism is rising in the USA, when it's actually been all our fault. It really has been fault of the entertainment industry, the gaming industry, the way we've done kind of education. Again, that's just my opinion. It is. That's why I think we do have to really rethink everything and think, like, what have we done? Because there is a reason why these young people are thinking Nazis are cool, and we're seeing all these things kind of rise. And I think video games, again, not addressing the Holocaust has been a huge problem, because everyone's getting their history mostly from video games, they are. And again, just even like, I remember Battlefield 5, for like, you could play as kind of the Nazis without the Nazi symbol, or even like buy DLC characters, buy Nazi characters to play as. That is hugely irresponsible, and I'm sorry I'm getting a bit nearly like angry at it, but I'm just kind of like, it's like things like that, actually just small things like that are part of the problem, I would say, just as much as all these young people that spread hate was in video games, because again, we're influencing these people through pop culture.
Thanks for that. That's a good segue to a topic I wanted to return to Rachel on. Rachel, could you tell us a bit about your work on identity fusion and how that might change the way that we think about extremist exploitation of the gaming space?
This goes back to what I was mentioning earlier about culture, and this was talked a lot about on the tech panel as well. And before I get into this research, I again want to preface that I am not saying that games are causing these problems, but rather they are reinforcing predilections, so to say. So identity fusion is this concept that comes from psychology. We have social identities and we have individual identities. All of us do. Humans like to put people in boxes, including ourselves. So for instance, I have the social identity, I am a gamer, but I have my individual identity, I am Rachel. And identity fusion happens when your social identity and your individual identity fuse together. And the best example I can give is military identities. My father was a Marine. Once a Marine, always a Marine. You cannot tie apart any part that is John, my father, and John, the Marine. So we looked at identity fusion of gamer cultures. First of all, can it happen? Do people have fused identities with this idea of being a gamer, and what does it look like if they do? So this was work done in conjunction with the University of Texas at Austin, and what we found is, yes, people do fuse with gamer identities, and when they have this fused identity, they also show these outcomes that are reflective of the normalized toxicity and hate in gaming spaces. So they ranked higher on endorsements of racism, endorsements of misogyny, endorsements of recent aggressive behaviors, endorsements of the tenets of white nationalism, personality factors like Machiavellianism, which is associated with cynicism and a lack of empathy. So I think it's really important to maintain the importance of the cultural aspects of games, both for intervention strategies, but also prevention, because top-down intervention certainly has its place and is important, moderation, game design, policy, but bottom-up culture change is where we're going to have the more diffuse, long-lasting effects, I believe, in gamer culture.
So as you can see on this panel, we're veering a little bit between kind of the big picture and how a variety of, either bad actors or bad attitudes might find the gaming space to be a place that can be helpful to them, and then looking at games for good. And so, look, I'm going to turn back to you on games for good. In addition to my company, Valens Global, I have a second company called Valens Games, which is active in the serious gaming space. And I'm much more likely to have my eyes come alive and to engage in very interesting discussions about game design than about extremism research these days. What I've found working in the serious gaming space is that it's about story, right? It's about world building, characters, narrative arcs, the kind of thing that keep us engaged. Serious games are often used for educational purposes, and the best kind of education or learning is effortless learning, when you can dive in and spend 5 or 6 hours without noticing that any time has passed. And so you'd mentioned before, Luke, that often you talked about Holocaust education, how sometimes it focuses on who the Nazis killed. And so I want to turn to your own efforts and the kind of narratives that you use. You spent some time talking about the kind of narratives that you don't think are very effective, but I'd like to kind of peel back a little bit and how you think that in either The Light and the Darkness or in your Holocaust Museum in Fortnite, you're able to tell a compelling story that reaches the kind of audiences that you're looking to reach.
What was the question?
The answer is, what was the question?
No, sorry, it's so...
Well, I'll distill it down into, how do you tell a good story?
How do I tell the story?
How do you tell a good story in this regard?
In a video game or in the Holocaust Museum?
Well, the Holocaust Museum is in a video game,
Yeah.
so you take your pick, whichever one is more interesting to you.
I mean, how do you tell that? That is a very open-ended question, because I mean, so I would say I could answer this. So I would say video games, for people who don't really understand them, I think they're kind of the next way of storytelling they are, because compared to, say, a film or book where you're more passive, in a film you're just watching characters you are, in a video game you get to kind of become those characters. So that's why I think the empathy level is a lot stronger compared to, again, people do cry during films, but I think it's even stronger with a video game. And so that's one thing which I thought was very interesting with Light and Darkness, is that I've had people from all over the world kind of like reach out to me, like Africa, Arab nations, just everywhere. But the common thing which has happened is that people have told me that they relate to these characters. They kind of see themselves in these characters, and I think it's because they got to inhabit these characters for an hour. And that's what I think video games are very powerful for. Compared to, like, say for example an ad, right? Someone does an anti-racist ad. It's 1 minute long, and it's like, don't be racist, guys. But video games can actually get people to understand what others are going through.
Yeah.
So that's why I think they can actually be really powerful for good. Like The Light and the Darkness, what The Economist wrote was... can you guys hear me better now?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, I guess my microphone's shit. Oops. Shit. Where was I? But yeah, basically The Economist said that other video games could use this model. They could pretty much. And so that's why I have had different groups, different people from different minority groups who said they've been inspired since my game. I even had like Ukrainians reach out to me, and they're now making a game about the war. They are. So what I really do appreciate with Light into Darkness is that not only has it opened up Holocaust education to be able to use video games, but also it's kind of opened up the video game industry to be able to do other serious subjects, because we did have serious subjects before, like The Last of Us, but it's still games set during kind of zombies. We haven't had like a game yet, as far as I'm aware, it's not fantasy-based, where it's purely based in history, but really a traumatic part of history. So that, if anything, I'm just happy it's opened up the doors for that, and you know, so our industry can kind of get treated more seriously, but also we can, I honestly do think we could change the world maybe for the better, which sounds very hippie-like.
So we'll turn to what a game or a gaming company can do to a policy question. So, Jacob, on the policy side, what do you see as necessary institutional steps to be taken in this space?
Well, if we consider the broader online policy landscape at the moment, we are seeing an emerging number of regulatory paradigms globally, the DSA in Europe, the Online Safety Bill in the UK, etc., which I think will have some implications for video games and gaming companies. The challenge there, of course, being that these policies have been primarily designed with social media in mind. And I think that it's helpful to explore that distinction slightly between social media platforms and games themselves, understanding that those gaming adjacent platforms like Discord function more like social media platforms. Now, social platforms are primarily focused around content creation, sharing, and community building. But in addition to that, a number of them do have business models which reinforce these harms, which can amplify and drive radicalizing narratives, which can reward conflict between people. There's less of that within games sort of inherent to the design, with the exception of the fact that you'll have people playing together. They might be trash talking one another, they might be harassing one another. So I think those regulatory paradigms won't necessarily map well fully over to the gaming sector, but really where we should be thinking of in terms of policy tools is moderation, effective moderation, and what does effective moderation look like? Again, going back to this, particularly around hate speech, given, I think, probably the likely very, very small amount of direct radicalization which is taking place, I'm not convinced that that could be identified at scale. And from what we heard in our working group meeting, I think that there are steps being made there, sometimes in leaps and bounds through the use of AI. And I'm not going to use this as sort of a moment to have a stick and beat the industry, but something which has struck me is the fact that there's not, doesn't apparently seem to be a huge amount of information sharing there, either between the sector, and as we know, although there are very, very big companies, there are also a huge amount of indie developers who won't necessarily get those tools and insights, so I think that that's a gap to close. But similarly also between academia and research, I think there have been steps in the social media space, although of course there are significant issues there, which I won't go into. You can catch me afterwards for that discussion. But I think that that same sort of information sharing and forum building is still something we need to do there and need to work towards. And I'm actually really hoping that the working group we've established here will be a vehicle for driving that as well.
Please.
All of what he said. All of what he said. But also, there are some policies that we can draw on from the industry that are setting standards already now. Niantic, our colleague Jen Weedon couldn't be here today, but they have a public policy for red teaming their content, for instance. The Fair Play Alliance has released their digital thriving playbook. It's openly accessible that people can access about how to create communities that thrive and have lower rates of toxicity and hate and harassment. I also want to talk about my colleagues at GiveCT. They did not pay me to say that, but I think they're doing a really great job at making things standard. So transparency reports, for instance, are excellent, but they're not super useful if they're not standardized. And so I think drawing on some of the resources we already have to build up at scale so games can tackle this more effectively, because essentially they're like 10, 15 years behind where social media conversations are. So what can we glean from that, and who are kind of the pioneers in this field that we can lean on to help build up capacity?
So it's deeply ironic, of course, that in one of the more tech-focused panels is the one where two of the microphones stopped working. So if you do want to talk about how extremists could also use microphones or lack thereof. But I want to get to kind of a final quick lightning round with two questions. Greatest challenge and greatest opportunity, both for gaming companies and also for those who are adjacent. I mean, for ISD, for Take This, you're adjacent to the gaming space. You reach in there. Luke is very directly involved. So I'll begin, Rachel, with you so that you can then pass the mic down to Luke while Jacob answers.
Greatest challenge is that the game industry is 10, 15 years behind and is relatively siloed, so it's very difficult to get everyone in the room. I've tried, it can happen, but it's hard. Greatest opportunity is to work together and be more powerful into moving this space and this conversation in a more public-facing and community-building way.
Well, I can't say those same 2 points again, so I'll pick a couple more out. All right, I'll go quite micro on the challenge. I am an analyst. I have teams of analysts now. I think there are still significant barriers towards generating good evidence bases to speak to the scale and nature of the challenge as it happens in game. We can survey gamers, but as I've said, unless someone wants to pay me and my team to spend hundreds of hours in game, I'm sure we'd be happy to do that. We're not going to build that evidence base. So I think that finding mechanisms to share insights out of industry or to provide data access would be hugely important here. And that data access question is something which spans far beyond the gaming side of things. If I'm thinking of opportunities, I really think that there is work which has already been done here, but there's certainly great potential in mobilizing gamers for good, right? As we know, it's the biggest entertainment industry now, right? We also know that there are influencers and streamers with huge reach and huge sway into young people, including vulnerable young people. I think if we can find ways to mobilize collectively to push back against that mainstream culture of hate and toxicity, which we've been speaking about, that would be hugely beneficial.
And Luke.
Question was, what's the greatest barrier which you're facing, and what are you looking forward to?
Sorry, guys. The greatest barrier which I'm facing. So I would say, since most people work in anti-hate here, is that when it comes to the gaming industry, we're a massive industry. And don't put all your attention on only the big ones like Activision, Call of Duty, all those things, because I don't know how much percentage of the industry we are, but we really are very influential, the indies. So even like a company like Epic Games is considered independent. Even Minecraft started out as an independent game. So I'd say for anti-hate organizations, it will be easier for you guys to work with smaller game developers than the big ones, because they don't share anything. They don't really share anything with our smaller developers either. So I would say on a grassroots kind of level, and that's where you can actually bring real change, because there's a lot of small gaming groups doing good things for diversity and inclusion, all those things. So yeah, that would basically just be my advice to people in this room. You don't just have to deal with Activision, all the big ones. Go towards the small ones too.
Well, I'd like to extend my deepest gratitude to all three of you for being part of this critical dialogue. We're embarking on a journey to safeguard the world of gaming from extremism and hate, and to discern best practices for using gaming for good. As we've talked about, all of us on this panel are very pro-gaming, but any sort of tool, no matter how wonderful, is going to have malign actors looking to exploit it, and can give rise to the same sort of toxic attitudes that can make our day-to-day lives difficult sometimes. The gaming world should be one where creativity, camaraderie, and positivity thrive. I'm excited for the discussions and solutions that we will continue to work toward within this working group, and would encourage all of you here in Pittsburgh with us to liaise with us if you want to be part of this solution set. Thank you.